It's May 2022. Santosh is visiting, and he asked me about the work I've done with the mangroves. And while trying to tell him the story, I thought it is a good idea to record it because so that others would get to know about it and what I've actually done. So I'd like to share with you this story about how it all started and what are the mangroves. And so it was, around 1986, 87 when I had left the Sri Chitra hospital where I was working. And, the fish worker struggle had also reached a real peak of activity. And through those struggles, I had understood that we were trying to safeguard the fish stocks because the fishers were using a fishing technology which was destructive to the fish stocks. But simultaneously, I had already just begun to understand feminism and trying to understand what feminism and the fisheries means. And I was interested to understand about a nurturing approach to fisheries because fisheries is all about just extracting fish from the ocean. And I understood that you cannot extract endlessly. You also have to be able to nurture so that the fish stocks survive. And although I'm no biologist or anything, I wanted to understand these relationships between people and nature and livelihoods, and how this relationship between nature and life is sustained. And so I actually went down to Cochin from Trivandrum, Cochin, where you have the backwaters and the ocean very close to each other. And I tried to understand what is the relationship between the backwaters and the ocean, who was a good fisherman who did backwater fishing. And he introduced me to this species of vegetation, which was the mangroves, and he was planting Rhizophora at that time. So there were two things. He explained to me how important this vegetation was for the protecting the fingerlings, where the shrimp or fish laid their eggs and the young ones grow. And it was the root systems of these plants which actually provided the protection for these fish eggs and the fingerlings, and the droppings from the trees which provided the food. So it was all very interesting to me to see this vegetation. This old man, how many of the mangrove ecosystems were being destroyed. And then I began to read about mangrove ecosystems and learn about them. And I had this desire to help fishing communities to also grow the mangroves themselves, because they depended so much on the resource that they provided and the coastal waters provided. So I was wondering how I could begin a program like this with the fishing community with whom I was already working. And I managed at that time to get an Ashoka Fellowship, which I finally got for 3 years, where I could experiment with planting mangroves on the one hand. So there was mangrove planting on the one hand, and the other work I did with this fellowship was to see how the husk, the pith from paddy husk, which accumulates on the coastal area where coir is made, how this husk could be turned into briquettes for fuel. So these were the two things I wanted to do, and I got this fellowship to do that. And so I started my mangrove experiment in the Cochin backwaters with this old fisherman and his son and two other friends, where we started to plant these seeds. And we did it through starting first a nursery and then planting them in the water, because the water levels were fairly deep in this area. I must say that we didn't have too much success in Cochin, where I did the original planting. But this helped me to learn the reasons why we had failed. And then I understood better areas, what the gradient of the bed needed to be in order to succeed. And so, with another group of friends, a little further up in Thrissur, in the Chetwa estuary, we decided to do the same thing, where we also grew a little nursery, and then we planted with the fishing community there. We planted the two species. Now that was a great success. That community of fishers did trap fishing, and they understood what the mangroves would. There were some degraded mangroves in the area, so we knew that these mangroves would take in this particular area, and we did this planting there, and that mangrove system has grown very, very well, and the fishing community around there still manages to get a lot of seafood from around the mangroves. Then subsequently, in about 93, 94, I had been to a seminar on estuaries, and there were two professors from a university who presented a paper on an estuary I knew very well, the Manakudi estuary, and they said that they had enough data to prove that this was a dead estuary. Now, this struck me. They were botany professors, and I was surprised that you could just decide that an estuary was dead. And they had done some sample studies of the bed of the estuary, where they had seen buried shells, and so which told them that there was fish decades ago, but there was no fish now. And I said to them subsequently, I said, you've spoken about the Manakudi estuary being a dead estuary. Can we try to see whether we can bring life back into that estuary? And they stared at me and they said, how do you do that? So I said, why don't we just plant some mangroves? And they said to me, what are mangroves? And I said, well, this is a vegetation, coastal vegetation, which grows in slightly saline water, and it's basically around a lot of estuaries. And they were taken aback, but they were willing. They said, we are willing to try. So I took the seed from Cochin to Manakudi, and with these professors and my friend Pierre Gillet and the fishing community, Maria Das and the fishermen over there who arranged the boat, and whom I had told about how important it was to try to regrow mangroves in this estuary. He was very keen and interested in it. So we did the first planting in that area, and planting is very easy because these Rhizophora seeds are, they look like drumsticks. They are very long, and you just plunge them in the soil, and after a few weeks they take root and they begin to sprout. So that's what we did. There was a student, these two professors, Maria Dasan and another fisherman, and we did this planting. And the student said, so now what do we do? And he called me after a month and he said, yes, the two leaves have grown. So he said, now just keep a watch so that, animals and things don't reach the area. And within a few months, these things had begun to grow rather well. So this was very interesting because it took very easily The rhizophora grew very easily, and a year or two later, we planted more of the Avicennia. And ever since then, these things have been multiplying. In 2 years, the root system of the mangroves where gave life to so much of shrimp that these professors got very excited seeing so much shrimp in the root systems around the root systems of the mangroves. Whatever grows in the estuary goes out into the sea to grow into full life, where the fishers then catch it as food. So this cannot be privatized by making cages and appropriating the shrimp in the estuary itself. Which they understood when I explained to them, and they stopped this program. But they did a lot of educational work on the east coast of the country, and also, got a national award for the work they had done in those years. That's how they began to understand the importance of the mangroves as well. And the fishing community subsequently going back there, and today went again with Santosh, where we see the mangroves have really expanded. Quite a bit of new planting was done post the tsunami because people realized that this was a way to protect the inner area from the big waves that came with the tsunami. And I remember at that time, post the tsunami, when the mangroves were really luscious, the government had helped 8 or 10 women with small little boats with outboard motors, where they could take visitors into the mangroves, because in the winter months, the colder months, the mangroves then began to receive the migrating birds, which normally come to mangrove areas in the south. And this is a wonderful sight, because there are a huge number of birds that come and nest in these areas during the migration period. And it's a sight to see and so the tourists come and visit the area. And these young women would take them into the mangroves in their little motor boats. But that doesn't exist anymore. That support program by the government was stopped 5 years after the tsunami. And so it does not exist anymore. But the fishers, as we went today again with Santosh to have a look, they are aware that this is an important ecosystem.